All right, so um, I don't know where to start this video. I've tried to film it a few times. I had an idea of where I wanted to go. I've watched the movie a few times. I have written out talking points. I've, gone over it in my head, tried filming this exact review, but I don't really know where I'm going with it. Have you ever had that, maybe like a writer's block, like a YouTuber's block, where you don't really know where you want to go with something? You just know you want to talk about it, right? And I, I found myself that when I actually started filming, and when I actually started talking about this film, on one of the many takes that I've done, um, I ultimately don't really know what point I'm making. All right. I don't want to sit up here and be preachy or pretentious or anything like that. We keep it real on this channel. That's what we do. Um, but I feel like I have to be a bit pretentious when I talk about a movie. When I talk about a movie that explores some really interesting things, like what does it mean to have success in business? What does it mean to betray your values for success? What does it mean to be a Canadian business in particular, right? These are all interesting things that, like you kind of have to turn on your English major for and really think about and talk about in, a way that you're kind of bullshitting, right? But that's not what I want to do. That's not what this channel's about. So again, I am struggling to figure out how I'm going to talk about this movie and going forward, how I'm going to do movie reviews of interesting things. So I think the best approach maybe is just to start off by talking about why I wanted to talk about this movie and what I found interesting and kind of what my ultimate goal is. All right. So my goal in making this video is not to promote myself. I'm not getting, I figure it's not to promote myself. It's to hopefully convince at least one of you to go out and spend money to watch this movie. All right. So the movie right now, at least in Canada, is not available on a streaming service as far as I can tell. If you want to watch it, you have to go on Amazon Prime and buy it or rent it, or Apple and buy it or rent it. And I know that a lot of you don't like to do that. Um, I realize that, like for the price of renting a movie, you can get like a Netflix subscription, and that gets you hundreds of movies and TV shows that you can watch. So it's not, um, I can't sell it in terms of a value proposition. Um, but that being said, I I think that it's important that we support movies like this. Right? I think it's important that we support sort of small scale, small budget films that tell interesting and compelling stories, and not only stories that are interesting and compelling, but stories that are Canadian. That are proudly Canadian and that tell interesting parts and important parts of our story. But before we get into that, uh, I know that last week I said if you commented on my video, I'd give you a shout out. So here are the first shout outs of the channel. Maybe, I don't know if I've given them before. But the shout out this week goes to Daniela. I don't know if you wanted a shout out, Daniela. I can't remember if it was in your comment, but you commented, so you're getting one. Congratulations. Yeah, so after that awkward interlude, let's get back to the topic at hand, Blackberry. All right. So the film itself is pretty straightforward. It's about the rise and fall of Research in Motion, the company that makes the BlackBerry. I think Research in Motion is still around today, but I don't think they make phones anymore. I think they make like phone software or stuff for the government, something like that. Um, but back then they were the bee's knees, right? If you had a BlackBerry, you were one of the cool kids on the yard. I don't really know what people were doing with Blackberries. I don't know if they had like games on them or whatever, but the cool kids, they'd always be off in their little corner, like texting like that with like Blackberry Messenger, um, just doing cool kid things. I don't know. I didn't have a phone until like later on. But it was really cool to have a Blackberry back then. They looked nice. They looked cool. It was kind of like this modern thing, like a little computer that you could carry around. And it looked cool until the iPhone came out. And then it was just kind of like, well, why would you have a computer taking up half your screen when you can have this really slick design that's, just screen? And they do explore that a bit in the last third of the movie. That part of the movie is all about how Research in Motion decides to respond to the release of the iPhone. And I won't spoil it, but basically they don't do super well. um, they betray a lot of their principles in trying to keep up with the innovation that Apple's come up with. Um, so that being said, the film itself is structured into three acts. The first act takes place in the late 1990s, and it's all about how the two co-CEOs and co-founders of Research in Motion, Jim Balsley, who's played by Glenn Howerton, and Mike Lazaridis, who's played by Jay Baruchel, how they decide to kind of combine their energies, combine their forces, and create the first BlackBerry and sort of put RIM on the map. The second third of the movie, the second act, is focused on a hostile takeover attempt that the company's trying to fend off. So by doing that, they need some very aggressive expansion. They need to innovate telecommunications networks because there's like limits on how many Blackberries can be used at a time. And it shows how the company goes about expanding in that sense and trying to increase their value to become a more competitive company in this market. Super interesting. And the last part is, as I mentioned, the iPhone coming along and ruining things for Research in Motion, and subsequently inventing the brand new, you know, probably most important product of all time that was released. All right, so that's the story in a nutshell. What really stood out to me about this film was, I guess, the quality of the writing and the performances. All right, so the writing was sharp. The writing was, a lot of it felt like real conversations between people, which is kind of refreshing in the film because when you go see Marvel, it's like pure exposition. It's like character A will be like, "Where is the cube of destiny?" And character B will be like, "The cube of destiny, which was forged in the fires of Mount Mount has been stolen by Arachnos, who is the villain of this film." And then another guy will be like, "Well, we have to stop Arachnos and get the cube back." And it's just not how people talk. Occasionally there's like a witty joke that's made, or somebody says something that's like clever or off the cuff or kind of colorful, and there's like a forced laugh that happens. But if you watch a Marvel movie, I challenge you to watch it and tell me that, hey, this is how real human beings have conversations. So again, that was incredibly refreshing to see in a film, was writing that's a little gritty, that's people talking and expressing things, and people lying and being dishonest, and not just providing exposition to the audience, right? Sort of expecting the audience to read between the lines. This movie did that really well. Another thing that this movie did well, as I mentioned, was the performances, right? So Mike and Jim, they are sort of archetypes, right? Jim is the hard driving, hard charging businessman who, he seems to care about nothing but the growth of the company. And Mike is more the technical, the techie, the product guy, right? He cares more about creating the best phone in the world. But even in those performances, there are some subtleties, there's some nuances. And part of that is, well, for example, Mike, who, although he is technical, and although he does care about the quality of the product, you can kind of see that he also cares about, building a reputable company. He cares a lot about his success. He's haunted by some past failures, and he wants to make a name for himself. And you see that, that nuance is carried throughout the film until the final act, where you see how Mike's character shifts into something very different than the first act. He changes as a person. Success and circumstance changes him. He's not just changed because a screenwriter decided he had to change. You can see in the film, okay, these are the events that led to his changing character, and this is why he developed. Jim too, he may appear as kind of like that ruthless, tough businessman who doesn't care about people, doesn't care about anything but the profit or the success of the company. But even there's some subtlety, right? That's played very well by Glenn Howerton. So the subtlety there is he does care about people. He does care about making sure his employees get paid, for example, which is a problem with the company. He cares about protecting the company and protecting Mike. And something else that's kind of interesting is that he's a big hockey fan. He likes hockey, but that's kind of like a deeper. There's kind of like another part to it where he is someone who is very proudly Canadian, and he wants to keep the company Canadian and keep things in Waterloo, and that comes into play in sort of the third act. Um, so those two performances, they're both great, kind of like when considered individually. But then when the two come together, it's like, whoa, there's some good chemistry between these two. I'm serious. It's like the best kind of non-romantic relationship I've seen in a film in a long time. Um, so these two dudes, Mike and Jim, they're very different. They have very different values, very different goals, different ambitions, but they're united by this thing called the blackberry and research in motion. And you see that, as they're working together, it's not just a kind of like they come together and they grudgingly agree to work together, or they suddenly get along, or they have like a cheesy, there's like always that cheesy scene in like buddy movies where they realize, oh, we're not so different, or like the Martha scene from Batman versus Superman. There's no Martha scene in this film. The two of them just realize that each one has something that the other needs, and they treat each other as such. And there is a mutual respect between these two. That's played very well in the scenes when they're together by Mike and Jim. Even later on in the film, when when Jim becomes less involved with Blackberry, you see that Mike still kind of needs his guidance and needs his help, despite being a very successful businessman and co-CEO in his own right. So those two together, when they're on screen, it's dynamite. It's powerful, and I'm not sure if this film will be nominated for any big awards or anything like that. I hope it is. It was well reviewed when it came out. But if there was reviews for reviews awards for acting, I'd say that those two are a very compelling case for that. All right. So yeah, they as they come together, powerful performances in their own right. And I think what I'm trying to drive at with these two things, with the writing of the film and the acting, is that as films become more and more of a business, as people look more to tools like artificial intelligence, to write scripts, to help tell stories, to bring things to life, as computer technology gets better, and as we're able to do really incredible things with CGI, I think it's worth it to look at these smaller films. This film cost $5 million. The most recent Avengers, I think, cost more than 300 million. So very small film compared to that. But I think it's worth looking at, as the media landscape changes, to look at these stories that are told and to look at, how something like a good script with good characters can be compelling. There's no super interesting settings in this movie. It's all in like offices or workshops. There's no big special effects sequences. It's not much action, that happens. This movie is one that really relies on character and writing. And of course, there's other movies like that exist. But from what I've seen, at least this year, a lot of those movies are kind of getting fewer and fewer, far between. And especially on streaming platforms, like every show I see on Disney Plus or every original show I see is some kind of special effects driven Star Wars or Marvel thing with multiverses and with big action scenes and explosions and stuff like that. But I think that something that audiences could benefit from is more of these kinds of stories, right? More of these stories that are maybe smaller in scope and scale, smaller in budget for sure, because I know Hollywood's been struggling to make its money back with some of these big releases. Smaller in scope, scale, smaller in budget, but that tell really human driven stories, right? Stories about people, and that are made to be driven by actors and by writing rather than by millions of dollars in special effects. And, I hope that Hollywood will offer more and more of this kind of entertainment to us. I think Oppenheimer is something that did that really well, but we're not talking about Oppenheimer today. We're just talking about this. And I think that this is maybe an elegant solution for some of the problems that companies like Disney or Netflix have been facing, or Prime well, Prime's part of Amazon, so they're fine. But Disney, Netflix with profitability, is that maybe the solution isn't to go bigger and bigger and bigger and make all these, spectacle films with famous names and famous directors and big special effects sequences. Maybe the solution can be to go smaller and smaller and smaller and focus on telling, stories that are a bit out of the mainstream and independent stories, and focus more on the quality of the writing, the acting, versus the amount spent on special effects. So, sorry. I realize this point's probably been made time and time again, and I just want to make it too. I don't mind adding to the noise, um, but I really do hope that people go and check this movie out and go and reward these filmmakers for doing something bold and risky, and not leaning so much into razzle dazzle, but leaning more into the quality and the heart of the film. One other thing I'll talk about, and this is something that's important to me as someone who's from Canada, grew up in Canada, who's lived in this country most of my life, is that this is a Canadian story. All right, so I'm gonna do a little thing here. Uh, just off on a computer here. So there is such a thing as Canadian films, and I'm not just talking about Bon Cop, Bad Cop. There's others too, but there is a Canadian film industry. Unfortunately, I think, just looking here, there's not a lot of Canadian movies that have come out that have been about our history or about Canada, like Canadian stories and about outstanding things that have happened in Canada or outstanding people from Canada. And, we get all kinds of content from the United States and from Europe, and we get a lot of movies about, amazing Americans who've done stuff or amazing British people who've done stuff or, like movies about American history or British history, but not too much about Canada. And I think that there's a lot of untapped potential there. We in Canada, we're like any other country. We have a lot of history. We have a lot of we have important people who've come from Canada who've done important things in the world. And I think that when you take a movie like Blackberry, although Research in Motion ultimately wasn't as successful as they thought they would be as a company, although they had a lot of trouble, and although the company went through some really dark eras, it's still a Canadian story. And this is still a movie that celebrates Canadian trailblazers and kind of reminds the world that, hey, this smartphone, this product that everybody uses nowadays, that people can't live their lives without now, that there's so much built into the smartphones, everyone has one, that this product, its great grandfather or its genesis is Canadian. This is something that Canada pioneered and put out into the world. And I think that there's other stories like that that can be told. And it's like that with most countries in the world. Like there's a lot of places in the world where we don't really get movies from there. We don't really know what those stories are. But I can't speak to that because I'm not from every country in the world. I'm from Canada. So I think that going forward, this is something that should be a priority for filmmakers, especially Canadian filmmakers and Canadian studios, is to try and push this content, not just on the CBC or Canadian media, but to try and push this more worldwide and, put our name out there, put our image out there, be unafraid to tell Canadian stories and to, show the world what Canada is. And I think that if they do that, they'll find some very compelling content. Like not every movie has to be about Americans who did really cool stuff during World War II. I'm not saying that that's not great content. I love Band of Brothers. I love The Pacific, Saving Private Ryan. I like too. But there are Canadian stories that we can tell. There are important. I keep saying that word important, but I think you guys get the point. I don't think I have to labor it anymore. Like, just tell more Canadian stories. Don't be afraid to be Canadian. Even stories about Canadian companies, right? There was a movie that came out a number of years ago about McDonald's, starring Michael Keaton. Well, why not make a movie about Tim Hortons? Tim Horton, the hockey player, he had an interesting life and he built a successful business. So why not make a movie about not just him, but the business he built and what happened to that business, right? Canadian banks, maybe. You know, I know that that's maybe not the most exciting topic, but could be interesting. You know, like Canadian businesses. Uh, so all that said, that's what I'm driving at here. You know, I know I'm rambling a bit. I like to do that, but make Canadian content. And again, if some of you guys know any good Canadian films or good movies about Canada's history, and please don't say Canada People's History, that CBC documentary, but like sort of like dramatized films, like those based on a true story films that are fictionalized. Comment down below because I want to know. I want to watch them. I might be wrong. There might be a whole plethora of Canadian content that I'm not aware of, and if there is, I'd love to be exposed to it. All right. So summing up, Blackberry. Again, I haven't done movie reviews, and I know that this review won't do this film justice. Uh, I find it difficult to sort of verbalize what I experienced watching the film. Putting a script together, it felt inauthentic. It didn't feel real. So I just thought I'd talk about it and just sort of like discuss things that I liked and talked about why maybe this resonated with me so much. And if you're someone who wants to see more of that Canadian content and who maybe thinks that Canada should be better represented in the media world, not just by Canadian actors starring in American films, but by Canadians making movies about Canadians, then maybe that's something that, you know, hopefully that if we vote with our feet and put our money where our mouth is, this is something that we can make happen. The other thing, of course, was focusing more on telling stories in film versus big special effects. And I'm not against CGI. I'm not even really against using AI to help make films. I think that those are really powerful tools that can do cool things if they're leveraged appropriately. But ultimately, I think that the core of a movie will always be that human story and will always be characters and you know telling something that's compelling. And again, I think that this film just does this so well, and it's refreshing to see it. All right, so I know I've talked about this for quite some time, but sort of the bottom line for those of you who've been waiting for it, Blackberry. All right, ultimately, I would give this movie a 4 out of 5 stars. It's suffers from some production quality that's a bit shoddy. You know, that's I don't think that's something that's necessarily a turn off, right? It's something I'll mention. It's not a turn off, but it's something worth mentioning. But that's more than made up for by the quality of the writing, the performances by the two actors, and really just how generally interesting the story of Research in Motion is. All right, so if you have 2 hours of free time and $6 or however much it costs to rent this movie, I encourage all of you to go watch it or watch it at home. Rather, you can't watch it in theaters. I encourage all of you to watch it, and yeah, another comment. Just let me know how it goes. Send me a message, right? If you enjoy it. If you don't, I'm sorry. Um, I'm sorry if you don't enjoy it. That's just my opinion. All right. Okay. So before we kick off for tonight, I know that tonight's video hasn't been. I know the past few videos we haven't talked about processed pastries. Again, I think I want to take this channel in a bit of a different direction where I just get up here and talk about things. But I promise you, next video will be a pastry review. We'll talk about one of the finest processed pastries of all time. Some of you can guess what it is. And yeah, we'll go back to form. But for those of you who are watching this channel just for the pastry reviews, I'm sorry to say that direction has changed. I want to try something new. Just try something a bit more, uh, just try something different and take it in, a different direction. We'll see how it goes. But yeah, next review for those of you who stuck with us will be a process pastry review. So thanks, guys. This is me signing out.